Hello and welcome to Louis Philippe in Pursuit of Excellence. My guest today is truly an Indian original. She's arguably the number one businesswoman in the country. My good friend Kiran Mazumdar Shaw. Kiran, great to see you. You look well after all your travels. Doesn't no jet lag, nothing affects you?
Well, it's all a facade, Vijay. But thank you so much. It's a pleasure being on your show.
Thank you very much for joining us. I mean, I've been following your story for years. I mean, you started your company way back when. We're going to get into that in a minute. But tell us about your early growing up in Bangalore. You're very much a Bangalore citizen, a Bangaloreite, I should call you. You're growing up, schooling, college, everything here?
Well, I was born in Bangalore. I'm a very proud Bangalorean. And I had a very charmed childhood, I would say, because, I grew up in this lovely garden city of Bangalore. It truly was a wonderful, charming, retirees' paradise or whatever you might call it. But I had a wonderful childhood. I went to Bishop Cotton Girls' School. I then followed it up with a pre-university degree from Mount Carmel College. And then I later on went to finish my, zoology honors, my BSc in zoology honors from Central College, Bangalore University. So those were my growing up years in Bangalore.
Now, let me ask you, what made you choose zoology at the time? It wouldn't have been the norm for someone like yourself at that age to go into zoology.
Well, let me confess something. It was a sort of a fallback option. I actually wanted to get into medical college, and because I didn't make it into medical college, the next best option for me was to pursue zoology honors. Because I actually planned after zoology honors to again try to get into medical college, but then of course I abandoned that thought midway. So I never really got back to medicine.
And then you went off overseas to do further education and pursued that line of education?
Yes, I did something very unusual. I then, after my BSc Zoology honors, I decided to go and pursue brewing and fermentation science in Australia, which I think was pretty unconventional at that time.
Yes, but it's completely left field. I mean, when you were getting ready to do this, did you have any input from your parents? Did dad or mom say, what are you thinking here?
Well, actually, it was my father who actually influenced this particular thought process. He was a brewmaster with United Breweries in Bangalore, and he was very keen that one of his children sort of almost follows his footsteps. And I remember, when I was planning to, look at my further studies, and I said, what should I be doing? I was very interested in applied science. And when I discussed this with my father, he said, why don't you, pursue brewing? I mean, brewing is a great profession. It has a lot of science, and it is the world's oldest biotechnology. So why don't you go and, pursue brewing? So that's how I went off to Australia and, became India's first qualified brewmaster, female brewmaster.
No, but is that something that you enjoyed right away? Is it something that became a passion for you? Was it something you did because dad wanted you to do it?
Well, to be very honest, when I was actually going to Australia to pursue brewing, I was a bit uncomfortable with the thought of, doing something with the alcohol industry. Somehow, we all grew up with this image that it's not a business or a profession for women. But when I went to Australia and I started learning about brewing science, I was quite fascinated. Honestly, I found it very fascinating. I got very interested in fermentation science and how microbes can do these wonderful things of converting, sugars and proteins and what have you into these wonderful molecules that are then enjoyed by mankind. I just found that whole fermentation science very exciting. So it started with a bit of skepticism, but then it became a passion. So I really got interested in fermentation science, and I was very proud then to, become a brewmaster.
Incredible. That's an amazing story, because you always think, I'm not going to do what my parents do. They were doctors and lawyers. I'm not going to be a doctor or a lawyer. And you went into it. Okay, so you came back from Australia, and you're young, you're energetic, you're full of thoughts and ideas. At what point did that turn into the start of this amazing story of Biocon?
So I came back from Australia, all set to pursue a profession and a career in brewing. I, got myself very engaged in a number of brewing projects as soon as I got back. But then, I started facing a lot of resistance because I found that nobody wanted to hire me in their breweries as a brewmaster. They were very happy to give me assignments or projects which dealt with problem solving. But they were very reluctant to hire me as a full-time brewmaster.
Was it gender mainly?
It was absolutely gender-based. I mean, they basically told me, they said, look, you are very qualified. We respect your expertise. But it is high risk for us to give you, this managerial responsibility because this is an all-male preserve. And to suddenly introduce a woman into this particular management sphere would be really taking a big risk because we don't think unions would accept you. We don't think our male colleagues would accept you, bossing over them or taking management decisions in the way you would like to. So I think it becomes very difficult for us to also entrust you with a lot of responsibilities which we believe are something which would be very uncomfortable for a woman to handle. At least that was their perception. And I was very disillusioned because I felt that I had all the credentials to hold such a post, but then I found that it wasn't going to be possible.
So it wasn't based on merit at that point then?
Absolutely not. So, it was a rude shock to me. I was extremely disappointed that, that my country and my profession wouldn't have me being a part of it. So I had decided at that point in time to really opt for pursuing a brewing career overseas because I thought maybe I'm more accepted overseas. And of course, fate intervened and I then started my biotech business instead, and therefore I call myself an accidental entrepreneur.
So now, was that when you were turned down in this to be a brewmaster? Did something fuel inside you that you felt that I'm being shunned aside, I must show them? Is there something that drove you to a point where I said I'm going to be an amazing success because they said I couldn't do it? All of those things kind of spurred your drive?
I was rebellious, certainly, because I was determined to prove a point. I was determined to show those very people who said I couldn't manage a business as a woman, that I could. So I think those were certain traits, if you might call it, or certain reactions to being rejected.
My mother would love you. I tell you that, because she is the one also started a business to end up paying for our tennis, which is so I relate to it very easily. So, who sort of inspired you at that time to be able to get started with your Biocon business when it's something that you're obviously going a slight change in your thinking, and obviously raising money was going to be a problem, and all of the issues that come with starting your own business?
Well, I was quite self-driven, really. I think at that point in time, I was determined to do it on my own. And I think I did sort of go about setting up my business, by knocking at every bank door. I found that even there, I had these huge credibility hurdles to overcome. I was 25 years old when I started Biocon. I was trying to set up a new sector called biotechnology, which nobody understood. And I had no business background, I had no money, and I had huge credibility hurdles because people found it very difficult to, lend me money because they said I was high risk in every way, And so I found banks very reluctant to lend money to me or even offer a credit line to me. I found it even more difficult to get people to work for me because they felt I was high risk in terms of job security. So it was very difficult in those starting years.
So then what made you decide you wanted to be an entrepreneur? I mean, you're facing problems with raising money. You're facing problems with the fact that you're a woman. and you're facing problems with starting a new business that people had never heard of. I mean, that's three big strikes.
Yes. So I think I was determined to make a success. I had to prove it to myself and to others that it was possible to be a successful businesswoman. So I think that is what drove me, that sort of that spirit of challenge and that sense of purpose. That's what really drove me into not giving up. And of course, once I took that kind of approach, I found that there was one banker who loved my story and was willing to extend a credit line to me. There were a few brave people who were willing to join me in my enterprise.
Now, what do you attribute that to? Is that a friend you had seen? Is someone you're meeting for the first time? I heard that you sat across the table with him, the banker, and had breakfast, and within 30 minutes, he kind of loved your passion and decided to back you.
So I think, yes, this came a little later, the banker that you talked about. It was at a time when I had started building the business, and my first big, next big hurdle really came about when I wanted to scale up the technology. And that was the time when, again, nobody wanted to lend to me because they felt, hey, this is an unproven technology, it's too high risk for us, and we can't lend money for this. And that's when the banker, Mr. Vagul, came into the picture. He was all set to, explore what venture capital and venture funding was all about. And he basically sat across at this breakfast table saying, tell me about this new technology of yours. I'm very fascinated. And when I told him that I had this wonderful technology, but there were no takers in terms of funding this technology to scale it up, that's when he said to me, look, I'll back you.
Well, I'm going to back up 1 minute there because you started originally with 10,000 rupees in your garage of your rented home in Bangalore. And, that brings back great memories of how my mother did it too. But I'm saying to you, what drove you at that point to invest 10,000 rupees, which you probably didn't have at the time? And did dad give it to you? Were there others who might have been interested in saying, I think she's got the passion, she's got the drive, let's start her up?
The 10,000 rupees were my life savings. Okay, I had saved up 10,000 rupees in my bank, and in those days, in 1978, 10,000 rupees was a lot of money. Yes. It was, in those days, I think it was all of, $1,000. Yes. Okay. So that's where that 10,000 rupees came from. That was all I had in my bank account. And the garage was the garage of my rented home because that's all I could afford as an office. And in fact, that became quite a challenge for me as well, because when I wanted to interview people to whom I was potentially going to recruit, they would take one look at this garage and look at it in a very dubious way saying, is this a company, which has an office in a garage? And so they would take one look at me and they would even assume I was the secretary and say, hey, we have an interview with the managing director. And the moment I would say, that's me, I could see this crestfallen look on their faces, and they'd almost turn down my job immediately.
So, all of these setbacks, early setbacks that brought you into the banker kind of revved you up at that point. But again, from there, trying to scale up, did you feel you were taking a monumental risk at this point?
I think when you're an entrepreneur trying to build your business, I think your risk appetite is pretty high. And I think managing that risk also almost comes naturally to most entrepreneurs. So I was taking risks, I was managing those risks quite effectively, but I knew I had to take those risks because without taking those risks, I couldn't build the kind of business I was trying to build.
Did you know where you wanted to be every 12 months or 3 years out?
I think, yes. I think at the early stages, it was 1 year at a time, and I knew what I wanted to do every year to get to where I needed to be. So I knew the kind of risks that I had to take on a year-on-year basis. And I knew the kind of scale-up I had to address on a year-on-year basis. So from that point of view, it was an evolutionary process where it was 1 year at a time.
Again, obviously things are not going very simply as you build a business from such high-risk situations. But anything that stands out in your mind right then and there?
So let me give you, yes, you're absolutely right. I think, failure is very inherent in that early process of building a company. So you're going to fail, but you've got to pick yourself up, learn from those failures and move on. So let me give you one big setback I had, which was the time when I was scaling up that very interesting unproven technology, which was backed by this banker who said, I'm going to bet on you. Now, I was very excited that I finally got somebody to back me, and that was a lot of money those days. He backed me with 1 crore of rupees, which was a lot of money those days, to scale up this, sort of homegrown technology, a high-tech homegrown technology at that. And I think one of the big setbacks I had was that the technology didn't work at the first shot. So that was a big setback for me, where I had realized that some of the scale-up assumptions we had used did not quite bear out. But we didn't give up, because we realized that we had made certain mistakes. And so we went back to the drawing board and fixed those mistakes. And that gave us a lot of confidence when they worked. So Mr. Vagul was not unduly worried, because I was really worried, saying I've let him down. But he said, look, this is a part of innovation. I'm willing to stick with you. Don't worry. I mean, if you can fix these problems, go ahead. And, let me know if you come to a stage where you say, look, I've failed completely. And I was determined not to let that happen, because I knew that we were going to be able to fix these problems.
Kiran, we were talking earlier about your early partner, Lesley Auchincloss, whom you had met on an aeroplane, and he took a stake in Biocon.
Yeah, we started the company as a partnered joint venture, where of course I had the majority shareholding and he took a small minority shareholding in that company. So that's how I started Biocon.
And obviously, when the bank came in, and Mr. Vagul, I would call him sort of a godfather, to invest in your company, but he didn't actually give you a loan.
No, he actually insisted it should be an equity stake, because he was,
so confident of your business.
Yeah, because he was starting this whole concept of venture funding. And so he said to me, he says, look, although you are looking for a loan, he says, I don't want to give you a loan. I'm investing in you. So I want to take an equity stake in your company, which I was delighted to accept, So that's how the whole, venture funding started in Biocon.
So at what point in time in those early years did you feel you were on the right path? Did he feel he was on the right path? Obviously, he also exited fairly early.
Well, soon after, ICICI Bank and Mr. Vagul actually invested in the company, my Irish partner sold his company to Unilever. And Unilever then de facto got a stake in Biocon, which was the small shareholding that they had in Biocon. And at that point in time, they suddenly realized that this small unknown entity in India was suddenly a very valuable company or a valuable investment as far as Unilever was concerned, because of the technology I had scaled up with ICICI's investment. They felt that this was very unique proprietary technology which had very high IP associated with it. And so they were very keen then to increase their stake in Biocon in India. And they basically realized that the only way they could increase the stake was to buy out ICICI's investment or stake in Biocon. And so actually ICICI did very well out of that, because they quadrupled their investment within less than a year. And so that actually spelt out a huge success both for Mr. Vagul and for me, because I had no idea what we had created and the value we had created.
So, of course, when you have those kinds of successes at an early stage, it's like rocket fuel, isn't it? It propels you into a different stratosphere with great momentum. Now, let's fast forward a little bit more, and then we get to a point where the company has grown, you've got hundreds of employees, and now you decide it's time to go to the market to do an IPO. And first of all, what prompted you to do that? Did you feel that you are ready to do an IPO and you're ready to reinvest that money into the company?
Well, that actually has two aspects to it. One is that, I started the company as an enzymes company, which was really developing industrial enzymes for a large number of industries. And so they were largely sort of industrial enzymes, which were really about developing, as we called it, green technologies or eco-friendly technologies. And a large number of those enzymes were used in the food industry as well. But, in the mid-90s, I suddenly realized that this enzyme business was not going to get me to a scale that I was aspiring for, because enzymes was a small, limited opportunity as I could see. So then what I did was I said, let me leverage all the technologies that I have developed for enzymes and see whether I could develop another business out of that. And that rationale or that strategy led me to biopharmaceuticals. Now, biopharmaceuticals was a very different business. It was a very capital intensive business. It had long gestational timelines because of the regulatory needs of that business. So I needed extra capital. And although I had started doing very well in biopharmaceuticals, I needed an injection of large amounts of capital, which is when I decided I must go to the capital market. And that's what prompted me to go for an IPO, to raise capital to really help me scale up my biopharma business.
Now, obviously, you had great advisors by this time and advising you that the market was ready for Biocon to do an IPO. Did you feel that you'd have this incredible success at the IPO? I mean, something like 33% oversubscribed?
Not really. I mean, I was very excited to go to the market, and what was very interesting was the process or the run-up to that IPO, which was really quite a great experience and a great learning experience for me. But I had no idea the kind of market response we would get to our IPO, or the $1 billion market cap that we attained on day one of our listing. I mean, we had basically valued the business at about maybe $500 to $600 million, even though that was quite a large value to kind of peg to this business. But I was quite confident we could get to that kind of a market cap because of all that we were doing. But what was really, really rewarding for me was on the first day of listing, when we suddenly saw our share price zoom to $1 billion market cap.
Now, did the original thought process when you started as an entrepreneur come to your mind? The gender issues, this IPO that was going to go out there, run by this chairman and managing director who's a woman in a business that perhaps is slowly being understood by the Indian market. Did all these thoughts go through your mind as you did this IPO?
Not really, because I was so fixated on just the IPO that it never crossed my mind about being a woman or anything. I was actually very excited that biotech had arrived. For me, the importance was that India finally had a biotech stock listed on the market.
That was obviously your goal and vision right from the beginning, to be able to get to this stage. And of course, the IPO thing came up at a time when you were sort of transforming your business to go into pharmaceuticals as well. Is that something that you had at the back of your mind when you started Biocon?
Not at all, Vijay. I mean, I always say that, look, entrepreneurship is such an evolutionary process that you never know what you're going to next do. And I also believe as an entrepreneur, you've got to reinvent yourself. So I started with enzymes and, I ended up with biopharmaceuticals. I think the future is also going to be very different. It depends what kind of biopharmaceuticals I'm next going to get into. But I think you've got to keep pace with emerging opportunities. I think you've got to keep challenging the status quo. You've got to keep challenging your business model. And I think it's very evolutionary. I don't think you can predict beyond maybe 3 to 5 years at a time.
Do you feel as you moved along this path and sort of moving with the times, so to speak, within your own business, did you feel at any point in time that your gender helped you?
I think my gender has been very positive for me, because I think I was doing something very unusual as a woman. So you do get noticed that way. I think I was also helped by the fact that I was also pioneering a new sector called biotechnology. I think that certainly has played very positively for me. But yes, I think being a strong business leader who is a woman does work to your advantage, because I think people do then respect you and see you in a very different light.
Is there a lot of also a feminine touch in the way you run your business?
Well, I think, I have my own style. I don't know whether you'd call it feminine touch or what, but I think every entrepreneur has their own DNA in terms of how they manage the business. I'm a very, open manager in that sense. I'm a very, I'm a manager who likes to attract a lot of and invite a lot of viewpoints, and we have a very interesting discussion on various issues before I basically then say, okay, now this is the way we should go. So I am a manager who has my doors open. I'm a very people-oriented person. I delegate a lot. My whole approach to management is get people to own problems, not tasks.
I'm sure it has, obviously, with leaders like yourselves who are original in women running major conglomerates and corporations, and there's still perhaps not quite enough in the world as we should have, considering the percentages. But path-breaking, you'd consider yourself path-breaking, of course, in this, both not just in biotech industry, but also in the fact that you're a woman heading up a billion-dollar corporation.
Well, yes, I mean, if you want to call it that, okay, yes, I think I have sort of shown the way to many other women that it can be done. In fact, I always say to other women, if I could do it, anyone can. But I think, yes, you're right. I think I do believe that by doing things differently, by being bold, by showing the right direction, I think a lot of other people can gain the confidence to do things in a much bolder and much more confident way.
Is it fair to say that the environment obviously has changed since the time you started your company way back in the late 70s? But more importantly, is there more competition, so it's harder to do it? Is there more talent, so the competition becomes even more? Is it easier to raise money, so it's simpler for them to be able to get into a particular visionary business? All of the above?
I think all of the above, because I think, yes, today, of course, things are very different to when I started my business. Obviously, when I started my business, India was a very different country. It was very under-resourced, and it was not that easy to raise capital. And I think things are very different now. I think you didn't see that many women in the business world. Today, I think things are very different. I think entrepreneurship is something which is celebrated. And I think you see the startup culture today is a very vibrant culture, which it wasn't when I started Biocon. And then, of course, you have a very nicely growing talent pool. Though, of course, I think what we now need to focus on is a talent pool that will get you to the next level. So there's a lot of talent pool at the early stage of entrepreneurship. But as you scale up your business, I think that talent pool needs to be expanded.
Kiran, we've talked about business, we've talked about your entrepreneurship and all of that. And now, this stage in your career, you're a major philanthropist, you've done a lot of things in the industry and outside. What would be your main focus?
I really feel that when you reach this level of success in whatever you're doing, I think you've got to give back to society. So obviously, I am a philanthropist. I want to bring about change. I do believe that those of us who are very fortunate to really effect change should do it. And therefore, I believe that my philanthropy at the moment is about making a difference in healthcare. And therefore, I've set up a large cancer center called the Mazumdar Shaw Cancer Center, which I've partnered with another very eminent and legendary Dr. Devi Shetty.
Yes, of course.
And I think that's where we're making a big difference to cancer care in this country, because as you know, cancer is a very expensive disease to treat. And I think in a country like India, you just have to develop a new model for cancer care. So that's what I'm trying to do at the Mazumdar Shaw Cancer Center.
Is it more on a research basis? Are you looking for that cure that we're all looking for?
Well, one of my mandates for the hospital was to create a translational research center, which we have, because I felt that in India we don't do enough research. And I believe that we are only using hospitals to treat disease, but we're not researching disease enough. So that was one mandate for the hospital, which I'm really happy to say we've managed to do. So yes, it is a research, led hospital. Now, other than that, I've also focused a lot on primary health care in rural India, because again, I'm very concerned with the fact that a country like India does not have a national healthcare system. And that, when you look at the people who are excluded from access to basic healthcare, it's pitiable, because you see that, the number one cause for indebtedness, whether it's in rural India or whether it's in even urban India with the poor, I think it is illness. I think when people fall ill, their life savings are used to treat the illness. So I just felt we had to do something there. So I'm working with the government. We've started a micro health insurance program called Arogya Raksha, where we've actually touched at least 300,000 lives in rural Bangalore and rural Karnataka. But it has to be scaled up. I'm trying to run pilots which the government can then scale up.
But is there something that you could work with the government as far as maybe trying to eventually perhaps get a national health service like the UK has?
So universal healthcare is something that I'm very committed to, and I think I'm trying to work with the government to see how we can deliver that. So that's why I said I'm trying to develop pilot programs in healthcare. One such program is something we're starting in one very poor district in Karnataka, where we're trying to use technology. We're trying to use technology-based diagnostics to basically, diagnose disease early and then use it through telemedicine to really sort of address the huge gap we have in the medical resources in terms of manpower. We don't have enough doctors, okay? We don't have enough tertiary care hospitals. We don't have enough secondary care, care hospitals. So how do you bridge that gap? And I really believe that it's through technology. So we're trying out some very interesting experiments to see how we can create a very effective model in terms of delivering universal health care.
Have things changed in that regard as far as, terming it an Indian way of doing business, or is it more akin to the West now? Is it more global as opposed to being Indian and foreign?
I would still like to say that India has a long way to go in terms of ease of doing business. I think it's too bureaucratic. I think there are too many approvals. I think we need to really get into a lot of self-regulation, self-attestation, self-approvals, rather than go through these hoops and barriers which are unnecessary. So I think, we do need to reduce those transactions and those approvals, because unless you do that, you're not going to unleash the huge entrepreneurial energy that we have in this country in the right way. I mean, today, despite all the odds, you still have a huge entrepreneurial energy surging this country ahead. But I think you can do a lot more if you just sort of addressed a lot of these issues.
It seems like you're always, I suppose, racing against time to get all that you would like to get done. And obviously, you've built an incredible business. You're, Time Magazine's most influential people in the world, Forbes top 50, top 100. You've all these accolades that you've received both from the government and overseas as well. Are you trying to do too much in a short span of time, trying to change the way we work in India?
I guess you could call it that, but then, I am racing against time. I don't have enough time. I'm growing old, and I don't have enough time to do everything I want to. So I guess I'm trying to address multiple things in a very short time. And I think really, I wish I was 20 years younger.
No, you built something incredible from your 20s onwards to this day. But what would you say to young entrepreneurs trying to build a life, as you have done over the last 30, 40 years? What advice would you seriously give them to say, besides just following your dreams and hard work, is there something that you can sort of hang your hat on?
Well, I certainly want to send a strong message to young people saying that entrepreneurship is truly a very fulfilling and very exciting journey for any young person to pursue, because I always say to young people, try not to be a job seeker. Try to be a job creator, because that's what an entrepreneur is. An entrepreneur creates jobs, an entrepreneur creates opportunities, and an entrepreneur realizes dreams, which I don't think you can do as a job seeker. And I think that's what this country needs. This country is about jobs. I think when I listen to young people, everyone is looking for a job. And I tell people, don't look for a job. Create that job yourself, because that's what entrepreneurship can do for this country. This country can be transformed if you unleash that entrepreneurial energy that is latent in many, many ways.
And finally, before I let you go, when you look back at your career, obviously you mentioned that interesting word of accidental entrepreneur in a business that was never heard of in India. When you look back and you look at the gender issues you've had and the challenges that you faced, do you look back and say, I did it against all odds?
I do feel proud that I did it against all odds, but more importantly, I think I have also created a very, very large opportunity for young scientists, for young women scientists. I'm glad that I was able to be bold enough to take certain decisions that I took at the time, because I think today when I look back and see how the biotech sector in India has blossomed, I can sort of secretly feel pleasure that I started a process which has now become a huge powerhouse.
Kiran Mazumdar Shaw, wonderful talking to you. True inspiration.
Thank you, Vijay.
Thank you
you
for
so
being
much.
here.
It's been a pleasure.
Lovely.